With me, I have a panel of esteemed colleagues, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. They're coming to you from around the globe. I'll start off with Nabeil.
Yep. Great to meet everyone, and very excited for today. So my name is Nabeil Alazzam, founder and CEO of Forma.ai. I came from working in the space of Salesforce effectiveness consulting and implementing platforms in the space. And what excites me the most about the conversation today is the fact that this is, incentives are about driving behavior, and what better a conversation to have than something that's very meaningful to how we can get the best behaviors out of a sales team.
Thank you. And Michael?
Great. Thanks, Justin. My name is Mike Ahearne. I'm CT Bauer Chair in Marketing, and I'm the director of the Sales Excellence Institute at the University of Houston. It's been around for about close to a little over 20 years, and I've been working closely with the Institute probably about 17 years of my career. It's the largest academic-based institute focusing on Salesforce effectiveness globally. And one of the areas that I do a lot of research on is in the Salesforce effectiveness space is incentives and motivation. So I'm excited to talk to you today.
All right. And then finally, Nick.
Yeah, hi, my name is Nick Lee. I'm professor of marketing at Warwick Business School in the UK and director of the Center for Applied and Social Data Science, which is the opposite of Mike's. It's been around for about 20 minutes, just about. It's very new. We've just started it out at Warwick, but I've been a professor of marketing and sales management and sales research for a long time. Worked with Mike for quite a long time as well. My work has sort of been a lot about industrial organizational psychology for a long time, moving into incentives as well, but also in interpersonal relationships and how managers and employees relate within the sales space.
All right. Well, thank you. Welcome to the panel, and thank you so much for being here today to help with this discussion. So I want to start off with an idea or a topic. And I think as we look at different pieces of the business, like marketing as an example, one of the things that they'll do is continuously test ideas and iteratively try to get better at things with even simple things like an email header to see what has the best opening rate. I think one of the things we see in sales, and in particular sales compensation, is that companies will come up with some ideas, they'll model and cost them, they'll make a decision, and then they'll roll it out to the field, and they'll let it run from some period of time. And so kind of the first question or topic is, should companies be more willing to experiment and test ideas with their sales force? And Michael, I'll throw this one to you first, because I think you have some thoughts and ideas on this that we've already talked about a little bit before we started.
Sure, Justin. Yeah, this is a really important thing for me to talk about a lot, because I think companies make a big mistake here. If you look at, just for example, the advertising space in the marketing and organizational effectiveness area, you go to any company, they're getting ready to launch an advertising campaign. You know that they're going to do at least some qualitative research about that campaign. They might do some field research on it. Oftentimes, they'll even do some A/B testing where they'll test it in one market and compare it to another market. And in fact, they'll quantify the likelihood that that campaign is going to have an effect and what the attitude towards that is. And the really interesting thing is in incentives, nobody does anything like that. In fact, it's extremely rare for anybody to test the effectiveness of their Salesforce incentive campaigns or their Salesforce incentive structures. And in fact, the interesting thing is in the US, we estimate that about $1.2 trillion is spent on incentives, which is about 7 or 8 times as much as on advertising, yet nobody's doing any research in the space, which I hope is changing, but it's very slowly changing.
And Nick, any ideas on why companies might not be doing it in this one particular area? What's holding people up from?
I think there's at least two things. One of them is real, and one of them I think is more of a perception. I mean, the real the real thing that holds companies up is doing experiments which involve people is not easy, right? And it's kind of easy to do bad stuff, but it's hard to do good stuff. But I think there's a perception among a lot of companies that I speak to when we talk about doing experiments with companies all the time. It's kind of like the gold standard for finding out what causes what. And so it's ideal. Any idea we have, we always try and find a company that'll give us an opportunity to do an experiment. And there's really a perception that there's some kind of lack of ethicality about putting one group of people on one comp plan and another group of people on a different comp plan. And then even worse, that if one group finds out the other group are in something different, then all of a sudden there's going to be this gigantic, at best, cultural problem, but at worst, people are going to start doing, legal cases and all kinds of stuff. So I think there's a fear that is it's kind of unwarranted, because these things can be designed in such a way that there is no lack of ethicality to it. We've been designing experiments for a long time, and I began designing training experiments where one group of people would get a different training program, and others would get this kind of placebo training program, and that companies said, well, we don't want to do this. You just kind of give everyone the training program after you're finished, for example. So all of these kind of perceived problems can be worked through, and I think that's the thing that holds most companies back from even really starting the conversation and even really thinking it's a realistic thing. So they never find out that all of this stuff can be managed. And the knowledge that you gain from it is definitely worth the challenge, and definitely worth all the different bits and pieces that you have to coordinate. Because of course, the other thing is there's a lot of moving parts within the organization to coordinate. You have an HR space, and then you have you have a sort of leadership area, and then you have the employees, and then you maybe have a tech implementation or something. So there's a lot of moving parts. And because it sometimes takes a while to get going, sometimes the champion in the organization moves on, and then you have to kind of start the whole process again. So there are real challenges, but it is worth it. It's genuinely worth it, because without that, you don't know why things are working. And I think that's one of the problems we find in marketing and sales all the time. We have a lot of knowledge that's not really knowledge. It's just based on what we've done in the past, and we've never really tested it against anything else directly. So that would be what I see.
Nabeil, quick follow-up here. I think from our perspective, we work with a lot of companies that struggle, right? When they do have like the comp plan to get it into an operational state to be able to administer the comp plan. And if all of a sudden now we're saying, well, hey, maybe try 2 variations of the comp plan to see which one works better. Leading question, how can companies get that agility to be able to model, test, cost, run multiple comp plans at once and see which one maybe gets better performance?
Yeah, I think you need to bring idea and execution as closely together as possible. And I think there's an element of today that process is disjointed, and I think that a lot of organizations think about strategy separate from execution. We were talking about this earlier, but this concept of even experimentation doesn't have to be this grand thing where we're treating people differently and taking that risk. It could be as simple as just how we communicate a plan, how we display it in a dashboard of the incentive tool that the reps are accessing, and playing around with how we get individuals, the human being, motivated the right way. And I think the one piece, Nick, that you brought up is actually really valid. Is we want to be equitable, but at the same time, sales in the world of sales, it's never equitable to begin with. Everyone has a different territory. They're selling to different customers. They're starting out at a different point from a territory base than others in the team. And we, at the end of the day, you have to tailor an experiment there. And the one final thing I'll add is, to kind of take it completely out of the sales world, but, you look at high growth startups and tech companies, what enables them to move faster is because we can move and experiment and trial and move forward. And the moment you get bogged down and not being able to experiment and shift things around, I think it does end up slowing down your ability to make those much bigger changes. Because today, when we make a comp plan change, we are betting the entire sales force and our entire revenue number on it. And I mentioned this in the past, wrote a blog post, but I think the sales compensation is one of the worst, it's one of the worst, if you think about it as a fund, as an investment vehicle. $1.2 trillion probably has the least rigor for a fund of that magnitude or similar size kind of investment vehicle, because we're not leveraging the data to make those better decisions. So.
Interesting. Anybody on the panel if companies out there wanted to explore this idea, maybe they don't want to start with two different comp plans, looking at some of the chat, right? This idea of, we wanted to see people, we're impacting people's pay, type of thing. Is there something small they could start on? Maybe a sales contest or something, like where it's not, maybe they don't feel like it's as big of a shift or a move that could impact culture or performance across the entire company? How would somebody get started?
I have a couple of thoughts on that, and sort of Nabeil referred to this earlier. I mean, one of the things you can also test is not only how the information is communicated to your team.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there's a lot of questions on communication. It's frequency of updates, like how frequently are you updating? Are you using dashboards? Are the dashboards you're using, or do they allow you to share competitive information? So can I tell where I perform relative to the way Nick performs or to the rest of the organization? Do I know specifically that how I'm performing versus how Nick's performing? How are those kind of things? So comparisons across, is comparison across performance people driving performance of individuals? It can also get to questions about the rollout of the plan. One thing that I've been studying recently is one of the questions is many salespeople, and we've done this before, we've tested people at time of rollout. Some plans are so complex that salespeople don't even understand how they're being paid. So when the rollout comes out, you do a quiz and say, can you answer these 15 questions about your comp plan? And you see how many of them they get correct. And the people who get it correct, do they perform better than those who don't? If you don't understand how you're being paid, you're not motivated based on that pay structure. So just the simple way of looking at the rollout itself, looking at the differences in the way information is communicated, that's completely separate from actually doing changes in the plan itself. And it could be even just implementing a minor change in one division and relative to another division, for example. So there are many ways in which we can test these things that could be very soft starts to be able to see what's happening, or year-over-year changes that have happened to try to be able to examine differences. So there's a lot of things that can be done without doing a full-scale A/B test out in the market.
Yeah, absolutely love the idea of checking in with the sales force after rollout, and understanding, how well do they feel like they understand the plan. Something you mentioned earlier too, this idea of market research. I wonder if more companies potentially, as they're designing the comp plans, could have a team of folks, or where they're testing ideas. If we're thinking about doing this, then starting to have some survey information around how motivated would that be to you? Does it seem fair? Does it seem, is that easily understandable of what you would need to do before they actually come to a final decision? But to get that rep input, into the plan and into the design. We have a question that I want to tee up here in the Q&A. And the question is, what do you think about individual KPIs and their incentives versus team KPIs and their incentives? And which one is more important for the company? Which one do you think drives success? And if anybody wants to jump in on that one, I'm going to try to find the name of something I just read recently pertaining to this very topic. But anybody have any thoughts on team versus individual incentives, and which one has a greater propensity for success?
A very brief answer is it depends, right? In my view, you can't answer which one is more important for the company in general. You have to look at an individual situation in terms of how. Research suggests that individual comp plans work better when performance is very much dependent or the sales is dependent on one individual's kind of behaviors or efforts. But then a lot of more, I guess from the British perspective, we talk about key account management. You might call it major account management or something in more international context. But when you have a key account where lots of different people are responsible for the ultimate success, it's difficult then to design an individual plan without some team component. I guess you're always balancing out the kind of, it's a little bit like being in a university group, isn't it? So there's always a free rider problem with team-based comp plans. You've got to balance out how much of that is an issue with how complex it is to allocate individual bits of the success to individual people. And so the answer to that balancing question is which one is, I guess, more effective for any given situation. That's how I would start to answer that. I'm sure that Mike certainly has a whole bunch of other ways to answer that too.
So I agree with Nick about the big challenges. If you look to the economics literature, they would say to you, anytime you have the opportunity to run individual versus team, you would always want to run individual because of the free rider situation. So if all of us worked in a team and we're incentivizing on the total team performance, one of us would drag the others down, and it would actually reduce total performance. But depending on the structure of the compensation system, and there's been a lot of really interesting stuff on this, it could be a way to be able to build team cohesion, for example. And I'll give you an example of this. There's a fellow that I've known, for quite some time, do some work with out of Harvard. His name is Mike Norton. And Mike does some really interesting work on this space where he did a study in the pharma sector where the groups work in these pods or units of about 8 to 10. And what he did was he thought to himself, okay, most of the incentives in these are individual because they weigh them individually. But how could they leverage a team-based incentive, like a one-off small team-based incentive, to build cohesion? So what they did was they used to have this award that they would give if the team made it of about $500 each at the end of the quarter for making a certain number. And what he ended up doing is saying, well, instead of that $500 that would individually come, we might get a $500 credit that we could buy a gift for another person on the team. Like I could buy Nick a gift. Nick would be assigned Justin to give a gift, et cetera, across the team. So by doing that, he actually saw that not only would it increase the motivation of the team because they were actually working together more and helping each other, but it also built the cohesion of the group as these one-off type of incentive plans. And I just thought it was fascinating. The data actually was pretty strong finding on that as well. And he replicated that in some other experiments. But it's interesting to see how sometimes group-based things can really, inspire helping that occurs as well.
Yeah. So I want to share something. I want to ask Nabeil a question from the CEO perspective. Mm-hmm. So I saw this just the other day, and I don't know if Nick and Michael, you're familiar with Sebastian Hohenberg, University of Munich. He did a paper with some colleagues, and they talked about co-petition in the presence of team and individual incentives. And their kind of core findings were individual incentives promote advice seeking, but discourage advice giving. Team incentives stimulate advice giving, but reduce advice seeking. And so maybe you have to think about the particular business context, right? Of what are you trying to do with that particular selling role up against that particular segment of the market you're trying to attack and determine, right? Do you need to experience people on the team giving advice to other folks, or do you need people like, to Nick's point, the individual prominence in that sale, and you want to give them an individual incentive? Nabeil, as a CEO, where have you seen like team incentives be effective versus individual incentives?
I mean, personally, firsthand, I think where the outcome to that we're looking for is bigger than any single person. So back to kind of Nick's point, it's even if it can be driven by a single person, there could be dependencies on other teams. The team-based incentives drive a much bigger impact. The other thing I would say, and this is where I would describe it as the loss of one person, like a major loss versus a slightly lower gain. So where I might mitigate my upside in performance, but that mitigating the upside in performance by not having individual incentives, but minimizing the drastic losses is where I would say team-based incentives tend to be much better. And so I think, again, depending on the organizations, and I'm talking beyond sales, just thinking about operations, and then obviously within sales, customer success, where maybe the advice seeking, to your point, and just getting to the right answer for the customer needs to be broader. But yeah, I would say that's kind of at a high level.
Right. I always like to distill these things down to adages or mantras, and I've always felt like if it takes a village to sell something, pay the village. If it just takes one, if one person can do it, pay the person. Try to keep it simple. But yeah, thank you for the question. Hopefully that got to the root of the question that was asked, and you have some clarity on maybe what to do.
I just have one very small thing to add to that, which is whenever we develop an incentive plan and we want to optimize that incentive plan, it should be, one of the key things is it should be within my control to be able to get that outcome. Yeah. And if the more aggregate that we make that incentive, the less it is in my control. So I'm less motivated to achieve it at that point. So the extent to which we can put it in the control of the individual drives the performance of the individual.
Yeah, the point of influence, the prominence, different people call it different things. I like that. That's so important for people to think about.
Yeah.
One other thing I'm going to add, because there's been a lot of messages in the chat related to kind of experimentation and the risk associated with it. I think it really is starting very small. I think, Michael's comment on this kind of team-based incentive where you give this $500, like that's an example where it's the risk is low to learn a lot. And I think one thing that we've chatted about briefly, part of this, is the amount of data that is available to sales organizations today means that we're not just taking blind guesses or hypotheses, right? When we take a stab at a small spiff and an incentive and see what happens, we should be testing and looking at the activity influx from the very beginning, from the day that it was launched, all the way through to the end, and understand how it changes and updates the behavior. So I think that's the one thing that we have available to us as organizations now that we didn't have 20 years ago. And I think that's it further feeds into the ability for us to be able to experiment in a very safe and equitable way.
All right, we have another question. I'm going to tee it up into the next topic to some degree. Try to tie a couple things together here. So the question is, should sales comp be paid to reps before the order is booked and the company begins earning revenue? So we have, most companies, I think, the conventional wisdom is we pay for performance and we pick some point of risk to the company on how we want to pay people. Do we pay them at booking, contract signing, invoice, cash receive, revenue recognition? We pay the reps sometime after a sale is made. Michael, you've talked about breaking reps into groups of laggards, core performers, and stars.
Yes.
And I think if I understand correctly, you believe for the core performer group, maybe it'd be better to pay them before the sale and activities and, stars maybe on performance. But I think it maybe, again, it was one particular industry that you were mentioning, and I'm not sure I understood that correctly, but I'll throw it over the fence, right? And say, like, how should people think about this? And is this maybe a good thing to go test with some of the populations in their sales force, to pay people on behaviors versus performance?
So even before we get to the the outcome-based versus behavior-based, one of the things I want to point out that this gets at is we want to pay and recognize performance for people at as short an increment as we possibly can. So we've done a number. Tom Steenberg, who's a colleague of mine that Nick and I do work with at the University of Virginia, he's done multiple studies on the question of paying people annually versus quarterly versus monthly. And what we find is, as long as however short it is, that sales cycle, how quickly people can turn things around, if you can reward them immediately at that time period, incrementally, to get them incentivized, the faster you pay out, the quicker, the more incentivized those individuals are. And he likens this to, for example, a school teacher that is giving quizzes instead of an end of year exam. So that school teacher that's wanting to motivate people to do better, if you're giving 12 small quizzes throughout each month, rather than one big annual exam, the students can work to those quizzes all the time. And what we end up seeing is the superstar students, like you're talking about, Justin, the stars, they're going to perform great every quiz anyway. They're going to study, they're going to work hard, they're going to perform great every quiz. It's not going to matter that we do 12 versus 1. But these average or core people, what's going to end up happening is that because they might have missed one, they're going to have a chance to go to another one. And basically it keeps them on task throughout that period. And it keeps a spotlight on them and motivates them to be able to perform at a higher level. So the frequency by which we incentivize is extremely important, which even goes beyond this question of the behavior and outcome. And when you refer to that, what I mean by that is outcome-based, meaning you're paying based on performance outcomes. Behavior-based is where we pay based on making sure that that person is engaging in the behaviors necessary to be able to be a high performer. And one of the things we know is if we can track and actually find the behaviors that lead to performance, and we motivate and incentivize people to engage in these behaviors properly, that the core performers benefit the most from this, because we can get them working harder at the tasks that we know that drive performance. We try to train on these, we reward on these, we end up getting a much higher performance level. There are many examples of this. I'm not going to drag on too long, but there are a tremendous number of opportunities for looking at behaviors that result in very positive outcomes.
Nick, agree, disagree?
Yeah, I would agree, of course. But I just extend the first bit that Mike was talking about in terms of timeline. You can look at that from a psychology perspective as well, not just about motivation and keeping people engaged, but whenever you have a consequence of a behavior, for example, a sales reward, or a punishment. Of course, I'm thinking about punishment as well as it's all the same sort of thing. You always want the consequence to be as close to the behavior as possible, if you can. Otherwise, connection between the consequence and the behavior is challenging for the individual, and that's just a sort of hardwired issue we always have to deal with. So unless there are negative reasons why you wouldn't want to do that, you should always try and reward or whatever consequentialize you want to call it. You should always try to consequentialize as close to the behaviors or the result as possible, right? Also, there's a discounting issue when money comes into it. We know we discount like far away pretty significantly. So the same amount of financial incentive has to increase if you're going to get people. So if you behave now for X amount of money in a year's time, the motivational effect is lower than if you were behaving well for X amount of money tomorrow. So there's a sort of financial discounting effect we have to have a problem with as well. So all of these things brought together, I think that the push is always to incentivize or reward as closely as possible. So I would just add extra weight to what Mike said at the beginning. Were you about to jump in, Justin?
Yeah, I was going to ask a question because I've always understood this idea, right? Stronger rewards, tighter between the activity and the reward, the timing has an effect, right, on whether it's a strong or weak reward. And I've seen like a trend in the industry to people, pay frequency increasing. And we see, all the way down to the idea of, if you drive for Uber, you can cash out, on demand, when you want to get paid, right? So you're kind of in full control of the idea. I've always thought companies should also do factoring on that money, like maybe you pay a point to get your money early, but
exactly,
that's a different topic for a different day. is like, instead of, and then people always ask me, so we need to run around, like just throw cash at people like on a daily basis. And I never have a great answer for this because and I'm going to ask the question now that I have some experts. Is a report, like is something virtual recognition, virtual display of how much somebody's going to get paid at a future date, is that a proxy for actually having it like in your hand? Like if you do it and you could see like an earnings board, this is exactly like a sales compensation statement. You do an activity that says, here's how much you're going to get, here's how much you're going to get. And at some point in time, you get the money. Are you still discounting it because you don't have it like physically in your control, or would that work?
Okay, so I'm gonna answer, and then maybe Michael answer from a more informed perspective. So I'm gonna guess from what I know, because I haven't read any research on that specifically. So my guess, and I'm taking a risk, I'm risking that I might be wrong. I'm guessing that it doesn't.
Yeah.
My hypothesis. Sorry, I should say that, right? I shouldn't say guess. My hypothesis is it doesn't function in the same way, because we can do experimental studies on discounting, and we're getting people to imagine what would you take now versus what would you take at the end, and that discounting effect, to me, that would be broadly the same as a dashboard saying what are you going to get at the end. So I don't see that would change the discounting behavior. But maybe Mike, he's a little bit better read than I am in this area. I think maybe he knows something different to me.
I think that the research has really shown that that there is some power in showing that the individual has that money accrued, that amount to them. In fact, there's been a little bit of research that shows that if I can like tangibly show this is how much I've earned so far, that's a pretty powerful thing to do, but it's not as strong as actually receiving the reward right now. So it definitely is better than letting the person float, not knowing how much they've got at that time.
So there's
But
levels.
it's not quite as strong as actually physically receiving the award right now. There is some really interesting research out there that would show that oftentimes the idea of psychological ownership, which is what's been studied, is the idea that we can feel loss with psychological ownership without physical ownership. So for example, I think I have this and then it goes away. For example, stock, I've seen my stock drop and I lose it and I just see a board and I've lost that money, but I haven't physically gained that money. I can still feel, a pain from that loss. And there's actually been quite a bit on the idea of loss aversion that's been studied around this to be able to show that the concept of loss comes down to the idea of psychological ownership by that individual. So, for example, we did some studies when people got prizes. So one of the studies we did is a lot of times in sales incentives, you have instead of a cash, they'll do non-cash rewards. You get points, and at the end of the period, you can go pick out a TV set or something else at the end of the period. And one of the things that we did is we did a study to say, okay, if you gave them the prize ahead of time and had them hold it, and then if they didn't make their numbers, they didn't get that TV set. They actually lost that TV set at the end. Was that helpful? And we actually found that had a very painful effect, that loss aversion. They had the TV, they lost it, versus gaining points, and then at the end, they just chose a TV set, right? So then we said to ourselves, well, is it just as powerful to actually wish that and put in their cart this TV set, and then actually we see that they had this TV set, but they didn't hold the TV set. And it was just about as strong an effect of actually seeing that they've already chosen this TV set. So they have this mental, psychological ownership of that TV set. So then at the end, they lose it. So, I mean, this is like point reward systems. So instead of having a point system that people accrue points and at the end choose the prize, we actually have them make a wish list for the prize. Then at the end, they actually lose it, which is much more executable than actually buying them a TV and having them hold it. But getting back to your point, Justin, I think there's power in showing them how much they have at any given time. not quite as strong as the actual physical holding of that
Yeah.
cash, for example, in that situation.
So thank you. I appreciate you teeing up the loss aversion concept. I think that people obviously, hate loss more than they enjoy gain. But I want to dig into this a little bit more. Nabeil, again, I hate like every time I ask these, I feel like the audience is like, oh, leading question, right? But again, we talk to a lot of companies, and when I say things like to them, like where it's trending for people to pay, go from quarterly payments to monthly payments. And we'll say that, and we'll see, sales leadership, even head of finance people say, okay, if it makes sense, or yeah, my guys and gals would be more motivated by that, they want to do it. And then we look over to the admin team, whether it's on Zoom or across the table, and there's a look of horror, right? They're like, whoa, pay more frequently. Like they're scrambling late nights and weekends to meet the current pay frequency. How can people use technology to get more nimble at this? If we know that if we pay people on a more frequent basis, cash in hand, tighter reward to the behavior we asked of them, we're going to get a better return on investment. How could people go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's it goes back to you need to think about strategy and execution as one. And if you can't go from idea to execution fast enough, then paying on a faster cycle, it slows you down. And so
more errors, probably, you're going to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that on the admin side for sure, but so to answer your question, I think there's an element of you need to streamline the process, not for just the payroll cycle. If you streamline the process to be able to iterate on change faster, then payroll cycles become a moot point. That's just an execution. But there is something, just to kind of go back to the concept of loss aversion, and then tying back to something that Nick and Michael, you both kind of touched on, this kind of frequency of pay. One of the interesting things that we have played around with, and not to the level of experimentation and tracking data as kind of what you've seen, but I'm interested to get your perspective on is if you are effectively doing those quizzes, but at every point at the beginning of every month, you're telling the rep you've earned $1,000 based off of your month to date or your period to date attainment. And every day that number either goes down or up based off the attainment. I'm curious, like this is the kind of stuff where it's really, you're not changing the mechanics of how you pay. You're really not changing the inequity, but we're just experimenting for this period to communicate it that way. And so like, is that an example of a quick win when I think about like for the individuals in the team, the sales professionals that are on the call today? Are these the concepts, when we think about loss aversion, that are quick wins for people to walk away today and kind of incorporate into their reporting and their structures?
I think one of the key things that we have to think about is in the goal setting literature, for example, on this. So it really comes down to how good a job we can do to set goals and how predictable the performance outcomes are too. Because we know that if we can set very good goal targets and people can be held to those goal targets at a smaller increment, that's very valuable. But if they have very little control because their sales cycle is longer, or they have little control over that, then it becomes not even reasonable to have shorter periods like this.
Yes.
And that's when we look at, like Justin was bringing up and referring to before, some of the research that I've done on behavior-based incentives. And what I mean by that is, now in the age of technology, we can actually track many of the behaviors of our salespeople, and we know which of those behaviors predict performance outcomes. And so we can incentivize to make sure that people are engaging in the right behaviors that result in most effective outcomes. Just an example of that we found is that, and I shared this a little bit earlier privately, we were talking about this, but I think this is a really interesting concept. One of the things I did was I worked with a major automotive manufacturer in the United States, and they got us partnerships with a number of different retail sales in the automotive sector. And in a typical US retail automotive, They might have 15, let's just say for a company like Audi, they might have 15 salespeople, 20 salespeople in a typical city in one of their retail outlets. If I did a competition this month, and let's say we had a lot of Audi A6s in-house, and we said, who can sell the most Audi A6s this month? And I said to them, they're going to win a prize, the person who sells the most Audi A6s. It was so predictable who would win that month. If I ran it today among us, and I would say, I could tell you at about a 90% rate the person who would win that month. But if we looked at the behaviors that their star performers did, and we started tracking, one of the things that they did is they said, what are the 5 major behaviors that we can document that result in better sales? Well, one of the things they found was the test drives. So what they found was that star performers, when a person comes in to rent, to buy a car, before usually an average performer, what they do is they see somebody come in, they want to get them to their desk and negotiate with them as soon as possible. They don't want them to leave that dealership, because if you walk in, I want to get you buying a car. So they'll get you sitting down, they'll try to sell you that Audi A6 after you've looked at it a little bit, get you down. The star performer brings you in the car, gives you a full test drive, maybe has you test another car, see everything about it. So then when you sit down with them, not only were they more likely to buy the car, but they're more likely to come back for service. They're more likely to buy add-ons to the vehicle, everything, right? So what they did was they said, okay, we need people to do test drives. So now the incentive is, instead of selling Audi A6s as the outcome for that month, it's how many test drives can we get people to do of Audi A6s this month? And so as a result, it's not so predictable anymore. It could be that Nick was the person that always would win them by selling the most. Well, maybe this month I can give as many test drives as Nick, but by giving that many test drives, and that's a behavior I want to drive, my sales go up and my behaviors become in line with performance standards of high performers like Nick. So understanding and identifying those and incentivizing them those right behaviors now, particularly in the age of technology, is going to be a real effective way to improve performance for salespeople.
Yeah. Michael, it's interesting. Every once in a while, in my brain, I feel like that some of the dots connect, and the giraffe or the elephant picture gets drawn. But this idea you talked about, giving people prizes they could touch and feel, and then taking it away, right? The visceral pain of taking it away. I'm like, oh, that's exactly what a test drive is, as opposed to me seeing a car commercial on TV and envisioning, oh, that's pretty cool, right? I'm touching, feeling the car, I'm in it, I'm experiencing it, type of thing. And then all of a sudden I'm out of the car and they're trying to get me back into the car.
Yeah.
That I just so, yeah. But, I think with that idea, as I think about this idea of, how the car buying experience goes from a consumer, and as we talk about these things, I feel like, okay, maybe I'm a touch more of an intelligent agent when it comes to that transaction, right? Now, when I think about a test drive, I'm going to, try to understand this is part of psychologically getting me to purchase a car. Do we have any duty to tell sales reps when we're doing things from a behavioral standpoint? Should we educate them as to what an intelligent agent should be in this case? Like, does that go with the communication of the comp plan, or is it okay to take advantage of things? I'll use an example. Left-hand number bias, like making their quota 999 versus 1,000,000 type of thing. Or do we just do it and it's up to them to figure it out?
I think that's a good question. I don't like. I think it comes down to the objective, right? I mean, this is in some ways it's kind of an easy question to answer in this context, because what are we trying to do? We're trying to get people to perform better. Yeah. And when in a sales context, when they perform better, they get paid more money. So I don't feel any great moral problem here with whichever one of those two behaviors is going to be the one that gets them to do the behavior that's going to help them perform better, whether it's telling them and explaining them the mechanism or it's not. Because we know that for a lot of behavioral issues, a lot of human biases, a lot of these judgment biases, even if we explain them to people, they still behave in that way, right? So the idea that if we explain stuff to people, then all of a sudden the magic is gone, That's not as, it's not that powerful for everything, right? I guess it does work for some things, but even if that was the case, what we're trying to do is help people and actually get them to perform better. So I don't see any great moral issue here. I think one of the things we talked about right at the beginning was advertising. I think when it comes down to advertising and stuff like that, and it's a slightly different issue. I guess we're talking here from the company perspective on trying to help our employees do better. Now, I guess if we were talking on a consumer psych panel or a consumerism panel, they might then say, well, you have to think about the customer, but that's probably a question for a different panel. So I'm not going to address that one. In terms of the ethics for our sales reps, I don't see an issue at all.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, at the end of the day, if we don't believe that those quotas are achievable, then they were the wrong quotas to set, regardless of the number. But Justin, I never thought of that before. And frankly, if it makes it more, it's still a challenging quota, but it makes it, if we can make the reps have a slightly higher conviction that they're going to be able to achieve it. If we're confident that we can achieve it, because,
still a win-win.
Yeah, it's still a win-win. Yeah.
I think that comes down to another angle on what Mike said. One of that amazing paper in HBR that Mike did with Tom on the different types of performer. We spend too much time worrying about top performers. It's a general truism that as long as you don't kind of annoy them and they go somewhere else, they're going to perform well for you, right? We need to spend more time thinking about these core performers and also these laggards. How can we bring their performance up? Now, one of the problems with people who are not top performers is if you incentivize them purely by sales targets, you sometimes lose the idea that again, Mike's talked about it, the idea of control. Like you demotivate them because they think, hey, I can't sell that many A6s. The same guy wins every time. But if you kind of incentivize them about test drives, many more people can think, hey, I can get people on test drives. That's not that difficult. And all of a sudden they're performing better. So I think that this whole idea about how we incentivize people can enhance their control of achieving the incentive. And it can bring a whole bunch more people into the sort of conversation of being motivated by incentives.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, it's interesting because like in the biggest reason why, or what we hear around the fear of paying on activity and behaviors is the cost and financial risk associated with it, right? Of course, it can be gamed. There is a cost that if we're doing 10 times more test drives, but selling the same amount as we did in the previous months. And so there's an interesting element of, what we've seen in the past is kind of having an initial behavior. And so our confidence that initial behavior is going to drive an outcome is X%. But when that initial behavior is followed by a follow-on behavior, the combination of those two behaviors leads to a much higher predictability of the bigger outcome and mitigates the finances. And then you basically allocate, a much smaller portion of the initial payment for behavior on the first behavior, but the much more significant payout on the combination of the two. And so, there are ways to kind of mitigate the risk. But yes, I think your point, Nick, is spot on.
I mean,
one last question for the group, and then I think we have some questions in chat and one on the Q&A panel that we'll probably use up the remainder of the time. We rapid fire, but I'll bring it up because I mentioned it in chat on the back of Nabeil's post earlier today. But he had talked about the idea of a sales leaderboard, and then I chimed in with Mike your idea again that we chatted about of putting, reversing it, inversing it, putting the lowest performer on top, which I said, maybe we call it a laggard board at that point in time. First of all, benefits to having a sales leaderboard. Are people inspired by seeing what's the art of what's possible, or does it invoke competition by trying to catch the people in front of you? Or do people, pull back? They don't want to stand out, and say, oh my gosh, my colleagues are looking at me saying I'm working 10 times as hard as they are. I need to calm down a little bit. Like, leaderboards, do they work? Yes, no. And then this idea of a laggard board, what would the different outcome be for that versus the leaderboard?
One of the interesting things that this is actually a question. I'm pretty excited about this. My daughter decided to actually get a PhD in marketing. She's just finishing her PhD at University of Georgia. One of the data sets that she's looking at is different ways in which leaderboards are displayed across individuals. And one of the things that she finds in her research is that when there's no board whatsoever, she compares people who have gone from one period to the next with no board versus they change to give their own performance. They're able to see where they are relative to others in the company, but no names are given, just information about where I stand relative to others. A third group, which is where I stand relative to others, and I can actually see who those people are. And then the last one is what they call the full information group, where I see relative to others in the company, but also what their quotas were, what their goals they were supposed to attain. And one of the things you actually find is that as you go up in this and you include more information, it drives performance even better. But then when you get to the part where you actually show the quotas, it becomes dysfunctional, because then I can start to say, well, Nick has a higher target expectation than I have. Of course, I'm not, Nick's upset now because Nick's, it's unfair for him. He's expected to perform at a higher
You can
level.
see on his face right now.
Yeah. So it's, but it's really interesting, but these are the kinds of things. And then of course, Justin, as you referred to, there's all kinds of opportunities. So I think what Nabeil was talking about before of just studying how information is shared, there's so many opportunities. And that doesn't even require us to manipulate or change pay plans or anything. And nobody really understands this stuff very well out there. But it's such an important thing to understand how we inform people, the frequency in which we inform them, the information we provide. We know that that's powerful, and nobody's out there doing that right now.
All right, so I'm going to go to some of the Q&A. I'm going to take this first one out of order, but it's the idea of, are there any books on sales incentive behaviors that the panel recommends? So I'll broaden it to books, journals, newsletters. How can people get more information around sales incentives and behaviors? This is where people can self-plug or plug colleagues or anything they want to do.
Yeah, I'm going to plug
right.
Mike. Yeah, look, I mean, I don't know that there's a huge, it all depends. If you want to read books about economics, there's a lot of them. So the book I learned from was called Theory of Incentives. I'm not sure I'm going to recommend that per se to anyone who doesn't want to spend a year on a economic, theory of agent, program. But, that's the kind of material that gets right into the nitty gritty. And then there's the paper I already referred to by Mike and Tom Steenberg and HBR. I think that's the best place to start in thinking about a broad perspective on sales force compensation and the concept of different things for different types of performers. I think that's a critical starting point. And then I'm not aware of a huge amount of stuff in the middle. Like, I don't see that sales incentives has a huge amount of, like, what I would call airport kind of books where you can pull them up and they bring these complex ideas into easy to follow programs for people, like, the kind of stuff that Seth Godin does with marketing, broad consumer marketing. Maybe Mike has more references than I do, but I don't see that space as very well populated. But I think, as I would say, that article in Harvard Business Review by Mike Ahearne and Tom Steenberg is awesome as a starting point to think about these issues, I think.
Thanks, Nick, for plugging the article, first of all. I appreciate it. But yeah, we really, it's one of my favorite articles that I've ever worked on, and it's gotten a lot of attention. So I'm excited about that. One of the things I would say for a book too is Nick and I know a fellow, actually, unfortunately, just passed away a week and a half ago, and his name is Andy Zoltners, and he's sort of one of the leading practitioners in the space of sales, and was a professor at Northwestern University and at the Kellogg School, and a founder of ZS Associates. And he has a book that's out there. It reads very academically, but it's very comprehensive. And it's called The Complete Guide to Salesforce Incentives. And I really like that book because it's a lot about how to set targets, how many of your people need to achieve their targets for optimal success, all kinds of things like this. It's not a easy read, but it's a very comprehensive read. I like the book. So that's one thing that some people might consider.
I think both Nabeil and I know I do have a copy of the book. You know, we all spent some time there at ZS, and yeah, I always call it the Green Book. And I have one copy off camera this way, and there's another one on my shelf behind me. But yeah, I go to that as a resource quite often. Nabeil, any thoughts or ideas where people can get more information?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, I agree with that. It's an absolutely great book, and yeah, I was sad to hear the news about a week and a half ago. I mean, I feel like I owe the early days of my career and where I am to Andy and Proba for building such a great company. You know, it's interesting, kind of light reads, and I think that the kind of the airport read that you're talking about, Nick. I mean, there's an interesting element of like there are some great, behavioral psych books that aren't necessarily going to be around how to do sales comp and execute sales comp, but they at least get us thinking differently. I mean, like I think about influence, thinking fast and slow. Like there's a lot of these out there that can kind of get you to be more creative. And so I think those certainly would be something to think about. Obviously, a plug for Forma, the newsletter. Here's the kicker that we produce kind of takes and the bite-sized chunks of content that we from our podcast and from great panelists like Nick and Mike, and kind of consolidates into an easy to read piece. But yeah, I mean, this is part of the reason why we wanted to do these types of events, is we feel like there's an opportunity to kind of further promote and scale up sales comp professionals everywhere with very thoughtful conversation. And so obviously thank you, Mike and Nick, for joining today. And yeah, really enjoyed the discussion.